also a Jewish library online that you can investigate for background into the Jewish understandings of Old Testament texts like Shabbat, which is Sabbath, or tzedek, which means justice. That's my Hebrew to impress you with today. But the idea is that to realize it's not just Christians that talk about the Sabbath, and it's not just Christians that talk about justice. And as I dug deeper into all of this, I learned some things. One is, for example, in this story from the book of Exodus, the reason for keeping the Sabbath is because of what we learned from the creation story. God creates us, God rests, and so as we read the book of Exodus, we are reminded that, hey, what does that mean in connection to the Sabbath? And you have to reflect back into the creation story. If you go to the book of Deuteronomy, where again we read the Ten Commandments, it's in a different context. And now we read that the reason for keeping the Sabbath is because God delivered you from the Egyptians, and that now you are free. And so you rest on the Sabbath day to remind yourself how God freed you from your slavery and your bondage. So we have those two major reasons. Both of them can be interconnected if you make the right connections, but I'm going to focus on the one from Exodus for today. And when we think about the creation story and the Sabbath and justice and what this might all have to do together, there's two things that can come to mind. One, in the creation story, we are created in God's image. Everyone is created in God's image. And to reflect on that for a moment, what does that mean? What does that mean when I talk about relationships with other people? What does it mean, for myself and for you and everything that can go with it in everyday life? The second thing that comes up then in the book of the creation story is that Adam and Eve are completely dependent upon God. They are dependent upon God for everything. Even so, yes, God has given them in the second story of creation, God has given them the garden to till and all this good stuff. But the idea is that still they're dependent upon God. And what we call sin comes into the story is where they look for a dependence besides God. That's a way of understanding the story, the apple, the serpent, and all of that, being tempted of the tree of knowledge. Why? Because you will be like God. You will no longer be dependent upon God. You can be dependent upon yourself. So we have those two things that come up in the creation story to be mindful of. One, we are created in the image of God. Secondly, it reminds us to be completely dependent upon God. Okay? So now we have the first reason for keeping the Sabbath, because in the creation story, God rested. And if we are in God's image, we should rest too. Right? If God needed to rest, well, what does that mean about our need for rest? And there's a deep need for rest in practical terms, for example. Way back when these scriptures were being written, there was no such thing as a 5-day work week. You may be aware that in the United States, we didn't have a 5-day work week officially until 1938. Are you aware of that? When Roosevelt had this law, the Congress passed these laws, it was the Labor Act, and was enacted in 1940, so that now we officially have an enforceable 5-day work week. Other than that was either at least 6 days and sometimes 7 days for the average worker. And it's just to be mindful that in our own American history, you go back 100 years, 7 days a week was common to work. Well, what did the Christians do? Well, I'm not sure. The notes that I read didn't refer to that, but I'm guessing the Christians were able to get at least a half day off, if not the full day off, on a Sunday. But also to remember that in an agrarian society, where you're farmers, especially now if you got cows, you have to work every day. You have to milk those cows, right? You have to milk them morning and night. So all of this comes into play about a day off, the Sabbath, and how that fits into this pattern of work and rest. As history goes on in the United States, since 1860 and so on, the idea of people needing rest becomes more prevalent. The idea is that, well, people actually rest more, they might actually feel more invigorated to work. They might even become more moral or conscious about their lives if they have a little more time for freedom and to interact with each other than working 10 to 12 hours a day. That's another thing. We don't have the 8-hour day until the 1930s as well. Otherwise, it was 10 to 12. Okay, so all of that comes in our genuine need for rest in practical terms. Well, again, when the scripture is being written, a 7-day work week was common. That was in the, if you understood the Jewish calendar. In other calendars of other traditions, Babylonian or Roman, we have 9-day weeks, we have 10-day weeks, because we all use a different calendar. But the idea was they worked every day of the week, and here these Israelis come along saying, no, we get a day off. Imagine how challenging that was for the foreigners. Who do they think they are? They can get a day off just to kick back and relax. And not only that, but they have the whole list of laws. There's 39 things that the Jews are not supposed to do on the Sabbath. And there's, I'm not going to reiterate that list. But the idea is all these things you were not supposed to do. Theoretically, for example, later today, we're going to drive to Forest Lake. That's against the Sabbath law, if you want to get detailed. We shouldn't drive more than from here to the house, maybe even that's too far. But you see how particular you can get. And that's a story that comes up with Jesus, by the way, later on, when the Pharisees are criticizing him. What are you doing this on the Sabbath for? Because they had all these rules of what they were not supposed to do. But then as Jesus digs back at them that, hey, you keep your tenth of this, that, and the other thing, but you ignore something. And what does he point out they ignore? This gets into the second reason for the Sabbath. The finer things of mercy and justice and care for others. And he's reminding them what they forgot about Shabbat. Because way back when, created in the image of God, God needing to rest, we need to rest. It begins to connect then with justice, care for others. Shabbat, in its deeper sense, my understanding, which I've carried for years, is to rest completely in the arms of God. And that's the starting point. But what grows out of that in showing justice for others? When we go through the Old Testament, we can see justice as being a bunch of laws, again, of how to treat widows and orphans and the poor and to remember them. But actually, it is part of Shabbat. It's a part of the Sabbath. It's part of remembering that because God cares for us and we are in God's image, we also learn to share and care in this larger world with each other. And justice comes into play. Not so much in the book of Exodus. Why? Because they're in the wilderness journey. The people are all together. And so, traveling through the wilderness, that's the story of the Exodus. And so they're living with all these laws of how to get along. But the real issue, words like justice don't come up. They don't come up later until they're living together in community. We read it much then in the book of Deuteronomy. We read much about justice in the prophets. And the idea is that now you're living in community. You got to get along. You have to show some way that you're God's people. And how are you showing it? Well, one of the primary ways was keeping the Sabbath with all the thou shalt nots, but it was also keeping Shabbat in the larger image of justice. For example, from Joshua Hook, he reminds us that the scriptures make it clear that our God is a God of justice who cares for all. He defends the cause of the fatherless and the widow. He shows no partiality. He does not accept bribes. He loves the foreigner residing among you, giving them food and clothing. And you are to love those who are foreigners, for you yourselves are foreigners in Egypt. That's from Deuteronomy chapter 10. And it goes on. The other one I want to highlight right now is from Isaiah 58. This is when the promise of restoration after they're in captivity in Babylon. And he talks about fasting in relation to keeping the Sabbath. And he talks about it in this way. Yet on the day of fasting, you do as you please. You exploit your workers, your fasting ends in quarrel and strife, you strike each other with wicked fists. You cannot fast as you do today and expect your voice to be heard on high. Is this not the kind of fast I have chosen? Only a day for people to humble themselves? Is it only for bowing one's head like a reed and for lying in sackcloth and ashes? Is this what you call a fast, a day acceptable to the Lord? And then I got in bold print. Is not this the kind of fasting I have chosen? To loose the chains of injustice, untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free, to break every yoke. Is it not to share your food with the hungry, to provide the poor wanderer with shelter? When you see the naked, to clothe them, and not to turn away from your own flesh and blood? From Isaiah chapter 58. The idea being that, hey, we can worship on Sunday and like we do today, and we might take the afternoon off and don't go very far. We stay at home, watch the ball game or whatever we're going to do. But the idea is that that's only half the story of Shabbat. The other half of Shabbat is what else you are doing for others. And that's the connection here to Shabbat. When Jesus comes in Luke chapter 4, the Spirit of the Lord upon me, because he's anointed me to preach good news to the poor. Does it sound familiar, what I just read from Isaiah? Good news to the poor. He sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners, recovery of sight to the blind, to set the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And that's a real deep meaning of Shabbat. Should I take that aside for a moment? It's going to take another few minutes. Shabbat was Saturday, literally, if you want to get into it. But there was another kind of Shabbat that God called for. That was that every 7 years, no work was to be done for a whole year. They were to depend upon God. They were to depend upon what they had saved up from the harvest in the previous years. They were to let the land lie fallow, which they didn't know really could help it. We know now it helps to let the land lie fallow. But every 7 years, you were to go through this, again, to show your dependence upon God. That's a jubilee, a small jubilee. Then there was the big jubilee. Every 50 years, you go 7 times 7, all right? So the 50th year, the jubilee year was that everything was returned to those who had it before. If you had owned land and had to let go of your land because of whatever the reason, your land was returned to you. All loans were automatically forgiven. You follow me? The idea was that in an agrarian society, if you didn't have land, you were dependent upon everybody else. And in an agrarian society, when you get your land back, now you can do something with it. You can be responsible for it, you can grow your own crops, and so on. Well, the history tells us that the Jewish people might have celebrated the 7-year Jubilee, the mini Jubilee, where you depend upon God for a whole year intentionally. But there's no evidence that they ever kept the 7 times 7 Jubilee. Yet here comes Jesus proclaiming the year of the Lord's favor, which those who knew meant the year of Jubilee, when everything is restored to the original owners and so on and so forth. Care for each other. That's what's being expressed here. Care for everyone. So that now you can earn your own living. You don't have to be under somebody else's tutelage and so on. The widows are now taken care of. The poor are now taken care of. Everybody's being taken care of. That is part of Shabbat too. So we have these 2 main points. I was told I shouldn't preach a 2-page sermon, but we have these 2 main points. 1, we are created in the image of God. What does that say about our relationship with each other? Get mindful now. Secondly, God rests, we need to rest. Well, now there's a third one. Because we care for each other, how do we share with each other? That's essentially the message for today. I could go more in depth because there were so many sidetracks to take today. I could tell you more about even American history. It wasn't until 1902 that the first Saturday was observed for some Jewish workers who worked at a cotton mill in New England. That's the first time the Sabbath was observed in the United States, literally, the Saturday. So there's a lot of these interesting things I looked up. I also have about 7 pages of scripture I could read for you here. But again, to remain the main thing is we're created in God's image. What does that mean about caring for each other? That's a connection. And secondly, Shabbat means so much more than simply taking a nap. It means remembering our dependence upon God and sharing our dependence with each other. So, you're supposed to get a couple of questions, right? Where are they? I actually made some questions here. Just because I wrote them doesn't mean I remember them. What happened to it? Huh? I know it's there. You got to help me again. See why I married her? She makes sure I do good. I can't find them. All right, let's see if I make them up again. Point 1 was, for your consideration, how do your thoughts, words, and actions show your dependence upon God? How do your thoughts, words, and actions show your dependence upon God? Actually, show yourself. We're not talking about proving to others now. We're talking about ourselves. How do my thought, words, and actions show myself my dependence upon God? Am I mindful of that? And the second goes something similar to it. How do I show justice to others? In what ways or how do I show justice to others? 2 questions.